Very formal. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for making time to come to this event. We are going to open with some opening remarks from Professor Mulwazi Mukwanazi, who is currently in charge of this building, and we'll introduce and I'm going to do this discussion on how to read war, and I hope it will be a patient, and we will open with comments from
Good morning, colleagues, and thank you all for being here. As Fraser already mentioned, my name is Nolwazi Konazi, and I am the Director of the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship, also known as CAS. Let me begin by saying welcome, and that we're grateful that you joined us today. Your presence matters. This is not because we expect agreement or consensus, but precisely because we do not. This event today is not meant to deliver conclusions or prescriptions. We're here to think carefully, flexibly, and without hurry. We're all well versed in reading texts, such as books, policy documents, and newspaper headlines. But we're far less practiced at reading the structures around us, those that announce themselves as texts. In architecture, this is a familiar idea. Buildings speak, they encode values, they reflect power, fear, aspiration, and reflect whether we choose to notice them or not. The provocation that brought us here today is simple, but it's also an unsettling one. What happens if we extend this analytical literacy to war? So before turning to this question directly, let me say why this matters and why this conversation is taking place at CAS, and why CAS deliberately draws on the wider university for doing so. CAS exists as an intellectual space, a space that's not governed by immediate policy outcomes or institutional pressures. But the space only has value if it remains porous. Thinking about war cannot be confined to a center, a discipline, or a small circle of specialists. It has to be in wider conversation with the university, with different tradition, instincts, and also different ways of framing what counts as a question. This is a two-way street. CAS draws challenge and intellectual friction from the campus, and in return, it has responsibility to offer not answers, but actually openings. Occasions such as this, where difficult questions are approached without the pressure to resolve them too quickly. So if this project works at all, it will be because of these kinds of exchanges. War, as we know, is a defining feature of our time. It intrudes into our daily life through the news feeds and conversations. Yet, for all its visibility, war is also encountered only at the level of drama. That is the event, the violence, turning points. What we often don't examine so much is the underlying structure, what accumulates, and what the silences are that actually make war possible, or even more. So for roughly the last 80 years, international life has operated with the assumption, often selective, sometimes naive, that certain rules and institutions form a stabilizing architecture. These arrangements were never neutral or evenly enforced, but they did sustain an expectation that war was an exception. However, this exception no longer holds. And what we see today is not just the return of war, but the erosion of these frameworks that once restrained it, which were legal, diplomatic, and moral. Violence becomes easier to justify, easier also to accommodate, and eventually easier to ignore. So this is where the idea of reading war becomes useful, because it asks us not to look at weapons and borders, but at the norms and the habits and at the failures of imagination. It invites us to see war not as an event, but also as a structure that builds over time. And architecture reminds us that buildings do not collapse without warning. Cracks appear, foundations shift. And the danger lies not in the damage, but in our capacity to adapt. And one of the most to read war then is not to master it or explain it away. A willingness to remain uneasy. It is an acceptance that we may not be merely observers, but we are inhabitants of structures, political, moral, and intellectual, that actually make war possible. And this is the spirit of today's conversation. What we have done is we've asked our speakers not for answers, but rather for reflections. And we've asked them not to provide solutions, but rather to give us a way of seeing. The structure is tight, and this is intentional. So what matters here really is provocation. It is not closure. We do not expect agreement in this room. Divergence we see as a resource. And if this project is to have any value, it lies in the fact that it unsettles things. So before we begin, I'd like to thank the people at CAS, the staff of CAS, who've made this very possible. And I'd also actually like to thank you all for the seriousness and the generosity that you will bring to this conversation. And finally, a personal word of thanks to the team that put this together. And I will now hand over to the chair, Professor McNeil.
Thank you very much, Nawazi, for the session. A couple of weeks ago, my friend Peter Vale phoned me and said, I have an idea. I want to get people together to talk about how we read war. And it sounded like an interesting idea. It's the brainchild actually of Professor Peter Vale. And when he asked me to do this, I thought it sounds like an interesting challenge. And for me, what will be most interesting is what comes out of this. Hopefully some kind of publication, but certainly something, as Wazi said, which is provocative and takes a slightly different angle. What was interesting about what Peter said to me and what really grabbed my attention was not any war in particular. War. And that really grabbed my interest. So, some ground rules for the discussion. Each of our participants has been asked to prepare a talk for 7 minutes, and I will tell you when you have got 2 minutes left, and I'll tell you when your time is up. Now, if we were on the 8th floor, which I usually am in the humanities building as an anthropologist, I would say that we open the trap door if you go over your 7 minutes or your allocated time, and then you fall into the dean's office. But I can't say that here. So you'll fall into the dungeon. But we will try and stick to time. So each presenter will have 7 minutes, and then we will have a chance for questions or clarification after each presenter has spoken. And then we'll move on directly to the next presenter. And after that, we'll open it for general discussion. So please be welcoming our first speaker. We're going to start from the far side, and we have Professor Magiri, who did send me a 2-sentence introduction on my computer, which has just run out. Professor Magiri, by memory, is an associate professor of jurisprudence in the Faculty of Law and is acting deputy dean and research. Professor,
very much. I've spent the time myself. Thank you, Peter, for the convocation and giving us from the management desks to do what we came here to do. What I'm going to offer here are some undisciplined remarks reflecting on the question how to read war. And I will start with the line from Dion Brand's poetry. We wait for narrative to do what war should or might do. This invitation to consider the protocols and possibilities of reading war as opposed to merely seeing it, prompts for me several interconnected challenges for any transnational critical anti-imperialist intellectual project. War has long been read as a signifier for a deathly, world-making fundamental antagonism that irretrievably reshapes geopolitical scenes of existence and remakes the terms of order by which planetary, social, psychic, and political life is lived. Often invoked as the primordial feature of the ongoing experiment in being human on the planet, war can be read as both pre-civilizational, in that it precedes order, rationality, discourse, and procedure, representing the ever-present death drive introduced to us by everyone from Hobbes to Freud. But war is also distinctly civilizational, as a constitutive device for constructing new political and legal orders, including the particular configuration we now anxiously call the liberal international order. Indeed, much war is waged in the name of civilizations, in defense of civilizations advancing their wealth and power, and against civilizations deemed inferior and savage. This association of war with conquest, genocide, atrocity, bombing, and blood is what led the revolutionary fugitive Assata Shakur to condemn what she called the death parade that marches through the torso of the earth, sculpting mud bodies in its wake. As she continues in her poem Affirmation, Shakur reads war as in both ethical and political terms, as the bringer of darkness into the world, physical darkness, political darkness, and moral darkness. And as she writes, I have seen the destruction of daylight and seen bloodthirsty maggots prayed to and saluted. I have seen the kind become the blind, and the blind become the bind in one easy lesson. We are bewildered in 2026 to encounter a new apocalyptic buffoonery, in the words of one such bloodthirsty maggot when he announced to the world through social media that a whole civilization might die tonight, never to be told again. This bewilderment continues when the institution that famously authorized the world historical wars of conquest that began Europe's modern colonial belligerence is now seemingly war's most powerful opponent. How did we go from the papal bulls of the 1400s declaring the right of Europeans to conquer savage lands and peoples to the encomium, God does not want this? Bewilderment also turns to irony when the country that famously elected to sacrifice its black people's right to justice in favor of a negotiated political democracy is now accused of an imaginary genocide, an imaginary war by the most radicalized among the progeny of those who waged war against its indigenous inhabitants. Now more than ever, it seems, we need to read war in this complex interregnum in which we are again cautioned against the conceit that any of this is new. If readers in the 21st century have become accustomed to reading war backwards as a tragic, moral, historical tale of humanity's ultimate limit point, as what we should not have done and should not do again, perhaps now is the time to admit that this was not the best reading. War, instead, might be read as the underside, the shadow of late modern political life, as the ever-present fact of material and structural violence of living in a liberal capitalist society. Not simply the dirty laundry of society, not simply the source of the world's moral shame, but as the possibility condition of today's global political cultures. From the idea of the Cold War that names the imperial ambitions of the Euro-American West to institute and reinstitute colonial and neo-colonial relationships and arrangements across the global South, to the rising waves of culture wars, marked by white racial resentment and attacks on ethical questions of justice and difference, demonized as wokeness, with particularly damaging effect on what remains of intellectual life in university. We might have to read the Bismarckian dictum in reverse. Politics is war by other means. We recall that prior to Trump there was the war on terror that devastated the Middle East, and before that there was the war on drugs waged against black communities in the United States. We recall that before October 7th there was already the ongoing Nakba. We recall as well that despite South Africa's alleged overcoming of racial civil war in its miraculous transition, there remains a now horrific socio-economic configuration of anti-black death in townships, usually described as the highest rates of violence outside of war. Recall further the long-standing feminist insight that warmongering throughout history has been inseparable from masculine aggression and the prerogatives of patriarchy. The notion of the imperial boomerang, which we usually associate with both Foucault and Césaire, suggests that colonial and imperial warmaking pursued in other parts of the world always turns back on itself, always becomes local, generating brutal police and security states, new forms of surveillance and control, and the politicization of differences that turns neighbors and strangers into threats and viruses, giving war a psychic and spatial life as well. War, it seems, is not the opposite of politics, but exactly its double. Not aberrational, but constant, taking familiar and unfamiliar shapes across time and space. We have not left it behind as much as we have simply been trained not to see it. This is why I read again beyond Brand's line, we wait for narrative to do what war should or might do. Thank you.
Do we have any questions of clarification? Was that completely? One question of clarification, please, sir.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Like I said, the comment. Does it take a spectacular war such as the one that was actually for us to have a discussion such as this, how great war? Because it seems to me that he's been informed.
I think it's pretty so just that verges for me into the discussion. Specifically questions of clarification. And please hold on to your question and you can ask it at the end when we can open up for broader. So park that for now. Thank you. Okay, our next presenter is Professor Joost Fontaine. Professor Fontaine is an anthropologist and is co-editor of the journals Africa and the journal Southern African Studies. Geographically, his work is based in Zimbabwe and Kenya. Theoretically, his work is based on materialities, death, and goats.
Thank you for inviting me. I got this invite last night, so this is the thoughts of hitting up an early morning and coffee. I was thinking about the question, and it's kind of an odd question, and I ended up thinking a lot about the relationship between violence and meaning, so that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to try and keep it short, because it's always long. When I was a kid, my mum used to try and stop me and my twin brother from fighting, which we did a lot, by saying, look, if you resort to fighting, you've already lost the argument. Right? And I think this relates to a rather broader common view, which you may sometimes hear, that war is the failure of politics, the failure of diplomacy, the failure of negotiation. And therefore, in a sense, war and violence are maybe the failure of meaning. Now, I don't think this is true. I don't think it's true at all. And there's an equally common adage which would say that war and violence is the extension of politics and diplomacy, and the earlier speaker, Joel, talked about this. People threaten war and violence as a way to achieve political goals. Most wars end in some kind of negotiation or some settlement. Most wars therefore end in some kind of reassertion of meaning. In the current context, we even have the odd spectacle of negotiations that seem to preempt war rather than end them. You hear about how Iran is rightfully mistrustful of negotiating with the USA because it always leads to more war. But taking a step back from this kind of current context, we can easily see that meaning making or contests over meaning, or maybe readability, has always been central to war making. Right? Think about propaganda, intelligence, censorship, secrecy, deception, contested narratives that are always part of war. Right? Maybe this has become much more prominent now than in the past, right? Competing narratives of war flood our lives through social media, with fake news ever more prevalent everywhere, you can't get away from it. Right, so gone are the days of, say, censored newsreels in cinemas, or waiting for the newspaper report to read a highly censored account of what's going on in some war or somewhere else. Right? I remember the first Gulf War in the 90s, and being told by journalists that this was the first war that was kind of broadcast live on TV. Right? Now, 30 years on, this seems to have accelerated enormously. For all the techno-optimism of the 1990s, this idea that the internet will set us free, well, nowadays, with this free flow of information, it seems that contests over different narratives about war, about violence, are easier, more prevalent, and it's easier to produce a narrative about war, and it's just as easy to produce a counter-narrative about it. So war today seems to be as much about contested meanings, readings, and narratives. And indeed, according to my Instagram feed, Iran seems to be winning, right? If you think about the Lego and the cartoon musical videos, this seems to be much more effective in some ways than billions of dollars of missiles and swarms of drones, right? So if war making is now, and maybe always has been, about contested meanings, readings, and narratives, this is not only an effect of war itself, but also precedes war, but more importantly, also follows war. I grew up in a small irrelevant island off the coast of Europe, which we call the UK, and if you live there, then you can't possibly escape the fact that the way that politicians and people in the UK think about themselves is totally tied up with how they understand World War II. So in the playground, we used to say things like 2 world wars and 1 World Cup whenever Germany was mentioned. But in Holland, for example, a very common joke is when a Dutch person meets a German, what they say is, "Can we have our bicycle back, please?" Across Europe, in fact, World War II is central to how loads of different countries and peoples think of themselves. And they are not all the same. Think about how Russia thinks about itself and its role in the war versus, say, how the USA presents itself in World War II, right? So, in some ways, World War II is still going on then. Right? So, if war making and meaning making have always been intertwined, the question, can we read war? Well, reading has always been part of war. And war, far from being beyond meaning, has always been deeply meaningful in deeply contested ways. That's my first point. But my second point is different. There's something else going on here, right? There's another thing going on that has to do with violence. Is there something about physical violence that is maybe not, or even an antithesis to, the very possibility of meaning? As an undergraduate in anthropology in the 90s, I remember being set readings about how experiences of extreme violence are beyond language. They are not communicable. They are unreadable. They are unshareable. So how victims of extreme violence and torture are unable to put their experiences into words and share them. Violence, in a sense, is beyond the stabilization of meaning. It is excessive to meaning. and victims of violence are unable to share their experiences through words. And therefore victims and, ironically, perpetrators of violence often share something that they can't express in language. Think here, perhaps, of the camaraderie of soldiers in a unit who, when they go home, can't express their experiences to their friends and family. 2 minutes, okay. So we can also think about trauma and PTSD. To what extent is trauma, and I mean real trauma here, I don't mean what everybody talks about their childhood, I'm talking about your legs being blown off or seeing your friends being killed. Is that kind of trauma about the failure of ordering events into a narrative that contains and constrains experiences? Something unresolved from the past that intrudes into the present, disorders the present, and leaves our comfortable understandings of narratives open-ended, unresolved. And this links to my own work on human remains. If I said before, past wars and past narratives of wars continue in the politics of today, then we also have traces of past violence, material and immaterial traces, ruins, human remains, bodies, trauma, memories, angry spirits, right? These traces of violence defy memory making, they defy meaning making, they defy reading. They're excessive to both. They're excessive both in their demands for stabilization, but also in their defiance of stabilization. So, there's a lot I can say about this. One more point and then I'll conclude. This kind of anti-meaning, excessive quality of violence isn't just accidental. In my own work on violence in Zimbabwe, for example, I kind of came to the conclusion that physical violence against bodies is often exactly targeted at the material, ritual, and immaterial ways through which people make themselves, through which people are constituted. Violence targets bodies, bruised, battered skin, open wounds, rape. They all target the bodily boundaries through which people are constituted. And violence often follows something that happens after violence. So, for example, in Zimbabwe at least, bodies that are dismembered and guns are disappeared, funerals that are disrupted and interrupted. There's a second violence that targets processes by which people are being remade after death. Is that no time? Okay. So the point there being that the sort of excessive aspects of violence are central to violence. So my final kind of point is the excessivities of violence demand the stabilization of meaning, exactly perhaps because they defy it at such a profound level. So war and violence demands to be read, to be ordered, to be meaningful, exactly because the violence of war challenges meaning so absolutely. Those are my own thoughts.
Thank you very much for Tim for that very thought-provoking presentation. Do we have any questions of clarification? Okay, in which case we shall move on to our third presenter. And our third presenter is Professor Namkrama Chanda, who is a Doctor of African Studies from research based in North Africa, mostly. Thank you very much for your contribution. Just 7 minutes.
I'm going to rush through it. Of course, this is a very difficult question that is presented to us. Not because we lack explanations for war, but because we are being asked something quite different. We are being asked to confront something more fundamental than the causes of war. And so my intervention today approaches this question from a political perspective based on my disciplinary background. And from that perspective, war is often treated as an instrument, something used to resolve political questions, whether those questions are legitimate or not. I want to set that instrumental logic aside for now. My contention is not whether wars are justified or not, nor about whether they sometimes produce the desired outcomes. Rather, today my argument is that war itself is best understood as a deeply irrational human project. My key contention is this. Wars tend to be grounded in forms of irrationality of thought and practice in advancing this claim, I'm explicitly arguing against rational choice perspectives on war. Approaches that assume coherent preferences. The sheer scale and character of violence that is inherent in war puts these assumptions under profound strain. Violence is not an unfortunate byproduct of war. It is constitutive of it. And it is precisely this violence that reveals the limits of rational explanations. I argue that the irrationality of war can be influenced, or rather can be illuminated through 5 interrelated factors that I'm just going to name. The decision to go to war is usually made in highly fraught environments. Ideology plays a central role. War collapses moral boundaries over time. Today's victims may very well become tomorrow's perpetrators. War frequently acquires a popular character, support from below, widespread societal support. And finally, death and destruction are guaranteed on all sides. Taken together, these 5 factors, they point to a pattern that defies rational choice. War consistently generates outcomes that are predictable in their destructiveness. To make this argument more concrete, I'd like to focus on a particular type of war, civil wars. Civil wars are especially perplexing because of the intimacy that characterizes the violence. Here, violence is directed towards people who share the same territorial space, often with long histories of coexistence, and in many cases, shared cultures or some form of shared identity. It is this intimacy that exposes the limits of rational choice explanations. The social proximity of the actors intensifies cruelty instead of moderating it. From a rational perspective, these conflicts are even harder to explain because the costs are immediate, they're personal, and they're enduring, while the destruction of social trust undermines any collective future. So, therefore, demands an even deeper level of understanding or vision in this case. They force us to ask how political identities become weaponized, and how fear and resentment are mobilized, and how violence comes to be seen as both necessary and legitimate among people who once coexisted. The African continent provides numerous tragic examples of civil wars in the region that I work on myself, in the Horn of Africa. 3 countries currently are embroiled in ongoing civil war: Somalia, Sudan, Ethiopia. In these cases, we see what Mahmoud Mamdani describes as artifacts of political violence in the form of skulls, of skeletons, of bones, of mass graves, standing as material reminders of how profoundly unreasonable war is. To be clear, irrationality is not the same as absence of logic, nor does it mean such violence is unthinkable. As Mamdani reminds us, genocidal and political violence can be planned, organized, and justified. But thinkable does not mean rational. The ability to organize mass violence does not redeem it as a reasonable means of politics. I therefore suggest that we read wars, especially civil wars, as unreasonable in their very essence. It remains deeply troubling that human societies repeatedly choose paths of death and destruction, despite the near certainty that less costly and less destructive alternatives exist. Recognizing this irrationality does not absolve responsibility. Rather, it sharpens our analytical and moral engagement with war as one of the most troubling of human enterprises.
Time, which perhaps gives us a moment to have some questions of clarification. I have a question of clarification I'd like to ask. For the purposes of your discussion, can you give us a succinct definition of civil war?
I will try. I would say that it is a war that exists within the bounded territory, with unfolding completely within those territorial boundaries. That would be a succinct.
I might pick up on that towards the end. Thank you. But it is we are proceeding, and our next speaker is Professor Tanya Van Wright, Associate Professor of Systematic Theology and Christian Ethics and Head of Department in Systematic and Historical Theology. Her research focuses on reconciling diversities. Put that in the plural.
Singular plural. Thank you so much. I think let me first say systematic theology is another name for church doctrine. And I can go into a winding explanation of why I prefer that. And I think it's because I am a systematic theologian and I find myself more comfortable in looking at the overall aspects that related to a situation. That I don't speak of church doctrine because church doctrine inherently is something that can be boxed off, and all the inherent suspicions towards it is sometimes valid. And so I'm saying this because I think what I prepared today really tries to look at an overall picture, and is not only my own reflection. Listening to the other speakers and also thinking about my own overview, it's clear to me that religion does play a role in a myriad ways that we recognize and that we sometimes don't recognize. And in my field in theology, systematic theology, it's customary to present your own positionality before you launch into a conversation such as this. And so first of all, I must say that I'm speaking as a Christian theologian, of course. There are many religions. Christianity's got a history of being focused on too much for a lot of reasons. I think all of us in this room are aware of that. I speak from this tradition while I acknowledge there are other viewpoints. I also do this because of the coverage recently received in the media and to persons who shall remain unnamed relating to the doctrine of just war and AI-generated pictures relating to the Christian religion. But in my faith and in my theology, it's very important to first of all acknowledge that one practices theology as faith-seeking understanding. So critically thinking about religion and critically reading biblical scriptures or sacred scriptures is non-negotiable. Right? Secondly, I'm speaking as a feminist theologian, which means I'm inherently suspicious from hermeneutics of suspicion between the relationship between power and knowledge construction. I think that's important to hermeneutical tools when one starts to read war. Suspicious about the relationship between power and knowledge construction. And I think everything that the colleagues have said so far actually links to this critical relationship between power and knowledge construction. Thirdly, a small thing, I speak from the field specifically of political theology. There are many definitions of political theology. One is a theology with its face turned towards the world, which is focused on issues of public, social, justice, power, institutions, economics. But there's also a big question in political theology about how the modern state today can evoke the type of sacrifice once associated with religion. which we see playing itself out around the world. And so reading war or responding from a Christian theological perspective may, I think, involve the following aspects. First thing, and this is uppermost playing itself out on the world stage, different wars, is reconciling Christian pacifism with military service, indeed participation in war or violence, or asking if there is such a clear-cut case for something like Christian pacifism, or religious pacifism for that matter. It's also in terms of the tension between thinking about when we try to understand or talk about war, if it's a focus on the ends of war or the means of war. So there's definitely a tension and sometimes an overemphasis either on the means or the ends. And this is something that you find in the revival of this doctrine of just war that's happening at the moment. There's a specific term which we refer to as the presumption against violence in the just war doctrine. And depending on how this, I read Catholic theologians' work, where after 9/11 tried to make a really strong case for the positive aspects of the doctrine of just war, and specifically argued that there is no presumption against violence in this doctrine. In other words, he's saying that this doctrine is actually a little bit positive about the use of violence. In a conversation between him and the previous Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams pointed out that the doctrine of just war is not overly positive about the use of violence and the justification of war. And finally, I think one important thing is reading and interpreting religious scriptures and the way in which we can or cannot draw direct examples, which is also seeing itself playing out over the world stage. A bit of context, you probably know the doctrine of just war was initiated or developed 4th century by Augustine, a theologian, sometimes linked with Africa, although I know there's a lot of debate about that as well. And it was basically because Christians were being asked by Constantine to participate in a war. So, okay, now my faith might say that I'm not supposed to kill, but the leader of my state is actually sending me into war. How do I reconcile this? So that is where this whole debate or the doctrine or tradition developed. So, on the one hand, Augustine considered that war is always the result of the broken human condition, in doctrine referred to as human sin, although there's always debates about that designation as well. And therefore, war should always be a problem and always wrong. On the other hand, he emphasized that war is sometimes a necessity in terms of a ruler, and that the ruler's got the responsibility to act in the public interest and the common good. Now, because I got carried away in terms of a lot of other things, let me skip to some of the main points I think I want to make in terms of how you read war from a theological perspective. I think the just war doctrine or tradition is not a blanket approval of violence, nor is it a blank check for a ruler to decide preemptively to rule out evil. Who decides what that evil is? And Augustine's doctrine was specifically linked to the conviction that such a ruler has been ordained by God. I think there's rather a lot of discussion and questions around how we think about that today. Students of theology is taught that religious scriptures are not textbooks, biological or historical, and so therefore they must be read and interpreted with utmost caution. And that is something that is also, I think, playing itself out within the world stage. So in conclusion, I want to ask a few questions in my Christian reading or religious reading of a war. Is the state ordained by God? Who decides what is evil? For some, it is about deciding whether someone has the means to conduct evil and stop them before they can. That's what happened in the Cold War. People have got these weapons, let's stop them before they can use it. Is that a just way to think about justifying war? Others follow a strategy of non-violence and say that you have to actually look at the root causes of what's broken in humanity and what leads to war, and not just immediately go on and to start a war. And so in the end, colleagues, I think there is a tension always between responding to evil, protesting it, protesting against injustice, protecting innocence, and the effects of that which will lead to violence. And my point in the end is that I think that tension should remain, because the moment you and resolve that tension. In either way, you have lost the important moral compass. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Our next presenter is Professor Bloom, who is chair of the UNESCO World Commission on the Ethics of Science and Technology. At the University of Pretoria, she's professor and head of the Department of Philosophy, senior fellow at the African Institute for Data Science and AI, and the UNESCO Research Chair in AI for Community Resilience.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. So, I think it's no surprise that on my reading of war, AI technology plays the role of a diagnostic for geopolitical shifts that impact and shape the format of war. In terms of military AI technology has been funded by the US Department of Defense, or Department of War, since the early 1940s, when funding was focused on computing for wartime ballistic and cryptographic needs. The impact of US funding on AI research was always clear, as illustrated by the so-called AI winter, which was largely due to the US defense budget being slashed in the mid-1970s. Current Pentagon investment in AI is roughly $13.4 billion per annum. Current projects include the Air Force's Collaborative Combat Aircraft, the Maven Smart System, and AI-powered drones, all focused on enhancing military intelligence analysis and combat operations by hugely speeding up decision-making capabilities. The US AI Action Plan, published in July 2025, states, and I quote, "It is a national security imperative for the United States to achieve and maintain unquestioned and unchallenged global technological dominance." End of quote. It's not just the US, Israel has strong military capabilities. Lavender, Roswell, and West Valley are AI systems developed by the IDF to analyze mass surveillance data to rank individuals based on their probability of being murdered. Some of these rankings taking less than 20 seconds of review per target. And also to identify likely buildings where they would be and flag when they get home. China aims to have a world-class military by 2027 and spends around $1.6 billion on AI research annually. They focus on AI for autonomous systems, intelligence analysis, predictive maintenance, and target recognition, particularly in maritime and aerospace domains. AI is widely used also in the current Ukraine-Russia and Iran-US conflicts. But there is more to the AI machine and its impact on world power balances than just its use in the military. It is crucial to understand that AI dominance depends on harnessing a much wider and more hidden set of social and political structures. And this is why interdisciplinary thinking here is so important. So in this context, firstly, the AI business model is surveillance capitalism, which aims at the modification of data for profit and geopolitical power. The model profits from the capture, rendering, and analysis of behavioral data. In Africa, this business model is concretized as algorithmic colonialism, driven by the hunger for data and corporate rather than political agendas. It is fed by digital poverty, intersectionality, tech solutionism, and geopolitical realities that allow big tech to continue practices flying in the face of international law, such as the exploitation of gig workers in Africa. Thus, majority world citizens face the possibility of their rights being disrespected, their humanity being ignored, and their culture being erased. This is why thinkers like Kate Crawford argue that AI should be understood as a registry of power. Secondly, we need to note that in terms of the so-called AI power paradox, there's a new global technological order in which geopolitics is not determined anymore only by sovereign states, but also by technology companies with immense geostrategic power, remain the elephant in the room in current world diplomacy context. In his 2021 book, War, Andrew Clapham argues that war is a state of mind in which language plays a strong role. Clapham points to, for instance, binaries such as us versus them, which them are dehumanized and such that war seems necessary. Adding war for words like detainees enables more toleration for the side who invokes war. The general public use of the term war in social context, war on terror, war on drugs, war against poverty, normalizes thinking in terms of or about war. Adding manipulative AI narratives and rhetoric to such language games enables the war by a mindset of awe and fear of powers harnessing AI technology that is now so strong that it enables scenarios in which international law violations are overseen. So on this structural reading of war distills into a quest for AI dominance. Now, from a meta-philosophical analysis, the values most at risk here are respect for and protection of human dignity and peace and security. The preamble to the Constitution of UNESCO, adopted in 1945, declares that since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defences of peace must be constructed. And calls for peace to be founded upon the intellectual and moral solidarity of humankind, not politics and economics. Noting that World War II was made possible by the denial of the democratic principles of dignity, equality, and mutual respect. A normative philosophical analysis, then, protection of human dignity calls for at least establishing the right not to be manipulated, the right to mental integrity, the right to protect the feeling what it is like to be me, secure private first-person access to ourselves. The value of peace and security calls for the right to be human, to have one's humanity recognized by other humans, no matter what the context. So interesting lines of future thought here again include for me understanding resilience against potential AI harm as building of societal infrastructure, not as an individual responsibility. Reading digital sovereignty as strategic autonomy, because what matters is not building the most powerful AI model, but who controls it. And raising awareness of AI narratives, feeding geopolitical and corporate objectives by manipulating worldviews. So in closing, I want to flag John Steinbeck's 1943 warning that all war is a symptom of man's failure as a thinking animal. Thank you.
Now proceed to our final presenter for today. Ken Thomas is the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor in the Department of Psychology. His training is in clinical psychology and neuropsychology, psychology, yes. And his particular research interests are cross-cultural neuropsychology and modifiable causes cognitive dysfunction. And it's also Professor Thomas's office that I was talking about that we opened the door to. Which nobody has done so far. Thank you very much, Professor Thomas.
Thank you, Fraser, for the introduction. I will say my office is lovely, so it's not punishment. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Peter, for inviting us to the panel. Thank you to Kaz for hosting us, and thank you to my colleagues for sharing the stage. It's really my privilege to speak on the same program. When we set out to read books or to read buildings, we proceed on a fundamental assumption that what we are reading will be legible, that the world will be presented to us something that is stable, that's capable of being interpreted, and that can be the subject of some shared meaning making. But war disrupts that assumption. And as as others on the panel have already said, war is unstable, it's pre-civilizational, it's deeply irrational. And what that reminds me of is something that psychiatrists told me during my clinical training, which is that evil is not in the DSM. What we think is evil is not diagnosable, it defies medicalization. It's not something that you can view from any kind of rational perspective. And so, if we accept that war disrupts that assumption that it is completely irrational, I'll try to explain in my talk today from a human and personal and psychological perspective how war disrupts that assumption. And I'll make the argument that because it disrupts the assumption, it resists it resists coherent narrative building, and it resists shared meaning making, and that in many ways then is actually anti-legible. And so perhaps the question shouldn't be, can we learn to read war, but instead, can war be read at all? And my point of departure, of course, is the branch of psychology, in which I've done most of my research. That's neuropsychology, which is the study of brain-behavior relations. And of particular importance here is that neuropsychology proceeds from the premise that cognition, emotion, and all forms of behavior are primarily and deeply grounded in the structure and activity of the brain. There's no cognition, there's no emotion, there's no behavior that doesn't emerge from that piece of organic matter. There's no magic. Equally importantly, however, is that all forms of behavior and cognition and emotion are also shaped by bodily and developmental and environmental contexts. And my work within the field then may be described broadly as how the architecture of cognition, emotions, and behavior are actually affected by disruptive external conditions. Stress, trauma, illness, infection, poverty, food insecurity, structural inequality. All of these external factors affect the architecture of cognition. And a consistent conclusion that emerges from the body of work is that cognition then is not neutral. It doesn't simply register reality in some kind of unvarnished fashion. Instead, cognition and emotion and behavior are shaped and sometimes profoundly distorted by the conditions under which they're operating. So we take war as an extreme environmental condition. It's not something that is registered neutrally by the brain. War, in fact, reorganizes cognition, it reorganizes emotion and behavior. And in doing so, it alters the very faculties to which we might seek to understand it. In essence, it is self-obscuring, and that's particularly true for those who are involved in it in some way. So, what I mean when I say war alters the faculties through which we might seek to understand it? Well, under sustained levels of psychological or physiological stress, you have a narrowing of attention, you have memory becoming more selective, you have decision-making that becomes increasingly reactive and biased towards salient short-term outcomes. You have emotional salience overriding any kind of detail. And these shifts are environmentally adaptive. There's reasons why that happens that have to do with the success of an organism. Every biologically and genetically successful organism has evolved toward those kinds of behaviors, those kinds of shifts. But those adaptations do come at a cost. And what I hope to do with the rest of my talk here is to help us develop an understanding of what those costs might be in terms of reading the work, and I'll briefly elaborate on some of the adaptations there. So first, memory. So as we all know, or as we all should know, memories are not mere reconstructions of previous events. Accuracy of memory is affected by a myriad of external and internal factors. These include the experience of trauma, disrupted sleep, heightened arousal, repeated exposure to and reliving of emotionally charged stimuli. And some of my research has shown that trauma and sleep disruption lead to less specific and less coherent autobiographical memories. In other words, memories of things that happened to you, memories of your life. And so, should we be surprised then that memories formed under conditions of war are degraded and fragmented and incomplete? That memories of war are not pristine historical archives. So war, in other words, compromises the legibility of its own history. Can we take another example then of environmental cognitive adaptation decision making? And war is often analyzed in terms of strategy, rational choice, geopolitical interest. But from a neuropsychological perspective, decision making under stress is completely divorced from rationality. It's very far from being rational. Stress alters how we perceive risk. It compresses temporal horizons. It weakens control of the brain's reasoning center, the prefrontal cortex, over its emotional center, the limbic system. So when one aggregates this across the actors involved in wartime situations, what you have is a series of decisions that are made under very biological constraints. And so war is very often not the outcome of rational, calculated decisions made calmly under ideal conditions. Instead, it's shaped, and it's not shaped by ideology and interest primarily. It's the product of humans operating at their cognitive limits, making decisions that misjudge risks, that prize short-term gains over longer-term rewards, and that are driven by hot emotions, fury, terror, and despair. And the final complication in reading war is the problem of interpretation. In cross-cultural neuropsychology, one of the things we spend a lot of time thinking about is how to develop assessment instruments that are fair across cultural, linguistic, and socioeconomic contexts. We do this because instruments developed in one context are not universally appropriate. They can, for instance, mistake difference for deficit. They can lead to misreading of individuals who don't share the cultures, languages, and social norms and lived experiences of those in the developer's context. So if we read war by relying on standard indicators, metrics, classifications, we base reports, risk assessments, and intelligence analyses with no regard for cross-contextual sensitivity. Our readings are incomplete. They may be systematically distorted. They may discount particular forms of suffering because those forms fall outside of normatively constructed frameworks. Those forms of suffering then are to the insensitive reader illegible. And that can lead to the kind of contested narratives that other speakers have already mentioned. So to conclude then, a key task in reading war is asking about which people and which instruments are appropriate, which are authorized to read war's altered architectures of cognition and experience. And if we are to learn how to read war, we must learn that reading war is not simply interpreting events, decoding symbols, interrogating archives. It's attending to the fragmentation, the lack of coherence, the distortion, the adaptation, and realizing that those things in themselves are forms of inscription and meaning making.
Every this tends to think of it, and the broad spectrum that people have presented here for me is fascinating because war is presented as something out there, something that can be read or possibly cannot be read or can be read within certain limitations. But I want to start the questions by completely abusing my position as chair. Why don't you get your thoughts on it? This, in the current context, does war mean us? So, in other words, does war have agency? We make war, and to some extent war makes us. So is there a sense in which war has agency? In its own right, maybe not, possibly. But how would war make us? That's my point. I think let's take a few questions from the please start by introducing yourself and your affiliation, if you have one, if you feel free.
Thank you very much for all your talks. And my name is Martin Rüder. I'm a professor of philosophy and ethics coming from a research center in Germany, research center in Munich. And almost on a daily basis, I'm constantly concerned with how the different views, how the different areas and subjects connect to each other. So we have sociologists, we have psychologists, ethicists, philosophers, and stuff like that. And I'm constantly irritated by the question because I feel I don't have a good answer to that. And it just, with smart people here who gave a talk about that. So I just want to hand that over to you, how you see the collaboration between different disciplines. So just like you said, there are different viewpoints and slides that the event is designed in this way, that we have different viewpoints. But how can the different areas and subjects collaborate with each other at the same time? So that's my question.
Thank you very much. Yes, and you the first question, so let's come back to
I guess I can answer my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It seems to me it's the so my question relates to all these conversations. I'm not trying to minimize the violence of this particularly to Professor Mujire, who mentioned South Africa, referenced South Africa, because I view South Africa as a country at war, not a country with violence, but violence at the levels of a country at war had not been at war. So if we revise our understanding of war, I think then we can come up with other readings of what is currently happening in South Africa. Lastly, I want to say, who sets the agenda? It seems the academic agenda of African institutions is set elsewhere without us acknowledging it. And I think that has implications then on how we war and how we divide.
Thank you. Those are the questions there for her. Three broad questions. Does war read us? How might we think about taking interdisciplinarity seriously in our discussion about war? And lastly, what is the metaphor and who sets the agenda? Professor Madiri, would you like to go first? I'm aware that you need to leave early because you have points to catch.
Thank you. Inside, a completely different one had I heard all of you if I spoke last rather than first. But yes, there are many things here that help me to think, and you'll see that I come from jurisprudence, not international law. So I'm sorry if you didn't get that. You got a bit of just war theory from Tanya, but I don't work in the realm of international law, and I come at this with a concern that the more we are anxious about particular kinds of war, the more we think that the solution is to restore the liberal international law. This is a chance to actually remake a different kind of political future. So let me just very briefly answer each question. I absolutely take the point that the problematic of war as a social problem cannot be theorized sort of separately. I see my work as undisciplined or anti-disciplinary. I think that in a sense what everybody said here is spilling over into other kinds. Nothing is strictly philosophy or law, nothing is strictly psychology or theology. And I think war in that sense, because of its precise ancient referentiality, is always already embedded in this. It is pre-disciplinary as well, and perhaps even also anti-disciplinary. So the way we do this, the way we think about the world we live in now, is exactly to be undisciplined. And that has several implications for the kind of scholarship and scholarly ethics that we inhabit. And so thank you, Nolazi, for a space like this. War is both replete with meaning, but also replete with silences. So even if we're here because we're watching what's happening in Iran and Israel, we know what's also happening in Sudan and Ethiopia. And even once we focus on all the military types of wars, we're also thinking about the structural and socio-economic wars, and the psychic wars, and the wars that weren't resolved, and the wars for which no justice was returned. South Africa is that country. So South Africa, for me, you're quite right, is a country at war both with itself, against itself, but it also has not resolved the question of what it is as a country. This, to me, is like the fundamental conceptual problem of South Africa is we do not really know what South Africa entails. So, does war have agency? That's a hard question. I'll stop there.
Anybody else like to?
Can I pick up on the agency question?
Please.
See, I think the question's wrong, Fraser.
Thanks, yes. That's what this space is for.
Because we have an idea of agency as a thing that someone has. I think we need to think of agency as an effective relationship in time. So when you think about it like that, and this is quite important because it makes us rethink lines of causality, right? That's why it's important. Someone starts a war, they have a purpose in mind, so it does something, but the war does all sorts of other things. The person who starts the war with an intentionality is not what the war does, is not constrained by the intentionality of the person who starts it. It has all sorts of other effects which can feed back in. So yeah, in a sense, war has agency, but only because it's caught up in chains of action in which agency is an effect. So yeah, that's my answer to that. On the kind of interdisciplinary, I think this panel is a brilliant example of how interdisciplinarity in terms of trying to make sense of war really works, because there are so many repeating themes and everybody, the questions around meaning, but also the absence of incoherence of meaning and how they interrelate. Everybody has offered similar kinds of kind of looking at the same theme but from different angles. So yeah. And the third one, I didn't really understand the question. Were you talking about method or metaphor? So maybe I'll hand it over to you.
That's the one I was going to avoid as well.
Okay, let's take it head on. I think the question was, is war a metaphor? If so, for what? And also, who sets the agenda in terms of how we understand war?
Yeah, it seems to me that our agendas are always set elsewhere, even if we think it's our agenda.
Okay, if you could respond to that.
Should I say this?
No, you've had your go. We'll move on.
I'll start with yours, if I can, and suggest that we need a second panel for the topic of whether war has agency or not. But I would say that as far as the material outcomes of war, how we observe wars in different contexts, then agreeing with yours to some extent, yes, we will say war is agency, has some agency in terms of how it plays out and the material costs of war, which are almost always death and destruction. So it's a very difficult question. The easier question is the one on interdisciplinary collaboration. I also have to agree that this is a fantastic example of how interdisciplinarity can help to answer some of the most difficult questions. Speaking from my background, if I confine myself to political science to answer what I see as political questions in the area that I work on, in Ethiopia, for example, it's very difficult to just understand and analyze political violence in Ethiopia purely based on political science concepts and theories. So interdisciplinarity is key. Yeah, I'll stop there.
And I think does anyone, do you want to respond to these?
Thank you so much. I would like to ask your definition of agency and agent. So, as I understand it, agency is something that's got to do with the need to act independently, be able to make distinctions and decisions. What is your definition of agency? Because if a war is in terms of making its own decisions, are we awarding personhood to a war? Are we asking or thinking that a war can act independently or in that regard as an agency to make further decisions? Are we making war a person?
Yeah, it does. So, without going into Foucault or June, does it have a life of its own? Does it possibly have a conscience?
So that already helps because if we then go further and say, does a war have a conscience? I think to latch onto the second question that's precisely why something like interdisciplinarity would be necessary to be able to answer that question. But I would also argue that a war, even though it can get a life of its own, can also not act independently, precisely for all the reasons that we've actually mentioned now, looking at it from different perspectives. So that would be my preliminary response to that, and I think that does indeed warrant a further conversation. Did I hear you correctly when you said that you are a little bit frustrated by interdisciplinary discussions? What is the core of your frustration?
Yeah, so the word was not frustration, but irritation.
Well, I softened it a little bit, but what's your irritation?
It's not about grant proposal or something like that. It's quite often that when people make judgments about interdisciplinary research, they're mostly lip services. You have a certain subject, you can explore that from different angles, but you also have to add a reason why you actually should do that. By saying, okay, there's more light on that subject and if we do that. Or that might be, or another option might be that you're saying, okay, here's a subject, a certain research question is being tackled by ethics. Another research question is being tackled by biology or something like that. So you have to be, more precise in general what interdisciplinary research actually is, and at least at my institution, probably not here, people are not doing that, and that causes the irritation.
So just to brief, I just want to understand, because as Joel briefly mentioned, and this comes out in political theology in the field if you start to go into one of the streams of it.
Right.
Augustine's doctrine of just war was later on developed by the scholastic theologian Aquinas. And all of that later on was, after the world wars, developed into legal or law jargon, which means eventually, although Augustine and Aquinas didn't use those terms, you ended up with these distinctions between ad bellum, in bellum, post bellum, which had to do with what's the reasons for the war in the first place. Then it's about the ends. People would focus on the ends. In bellum is focusing about what's happening in that war, and then usually people who are against or don't want to use the doctrine of just war says, but what's happening in that war? And that's the problem, as many speakers have said in terms of the violence. But then there's also the question, this is particular interest, I think, or importance, the question that was asked in the last, in terms of how do you approach what happens after the war, the restitution, the reconciliation, the repatriation, whatever you want to, how does that agenda in terms of and that's something in this country and in world wars we still struggle with. Just based on that one thing, I agree that we have to seriously think about interdisciplinarity and what its definition is, but this is one example of how so many of our legal jargon and concepts has got religious roots. And this is something that we actually have to further consider. Even if you think about something about how marriage laws in this country and the world has been constituted, there's a direct relationship between law and religion, and that would be an argument, I think, to take this forward. Just some remarks.
Thank you. If does it have agency? I would never agree that an AI algorithm have agency. Not should, whether it's possible, and I hope that people fight me on this, so that I can tell you why. But they will certainly, the problem is that they deceive us to think that they have agency. And this is much more dangerous. In terms of the interdisciplinary question, I think if we look at where we are now in the context of the discussion today, when we find ourselves in the world today, we have never been in more need of all hands on deck. We are worse off than directly after the Second World War. It is worse than saying that we don't have international humanitarian law yet established. We don't have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights established. It's worse than that because we had it. And I'm saying had because it is under attack from various sides for various reasons. I'm not necessarily saying that we need interdisciplinary thinking to scaffold it back up. But what we do need is interdisciplinary thinking to find something in its place. And one aspect of that must be multilateralism. It has to stay. We have to retain although it is part of neoliberalism, the world comes together when the world will face the same destructive force. But there are other ways in which to think about this. So interdisciplinary thinking is more important than ever, specifically for this, because we have to rethink what we thought worked. And we don't have a lot of time. And secondly, just to say, it's not just interdisciplinary, it's also internation. There is a word like that, I've just made that. But we need, if you think in terms of what multilateralism means, it means that different countries can have conversations with each other, and there's a very low definition of that. But what is interesting in the context of AI, this year specifically, given where we are, all nations are rethinking what digital sovereignty means. And we are seeing new partnerships between the majority world and, for instance, the EU. So trying to reshape their dependence on US tech companies, for instance, and geopolitical power that comes from that side, US technology. So it is really important to have an overall, whole-of approach, I think, more than ever, and clarity. Who sets the agenda? At the moment, it seems to me, sir, that the people who set the agenda in terms of war are the people with the most technological power. Whether we should just accept that or not, is a different question, and I don't think we should. But what will it take? Again, interdisciplinary thinking to find ways to counter that.
So, in terms of your question, does the world have agency? If we think that what that means is that the individual that it has that it can operate as a person does with some kind of function in the world, and I would say we have to then think about what is the function, what is the purpose, because all organisms have some purpose. What is the function? Very closely related to one another. So, who sets the agenda, as Emma said? Is it the people with the power? And, that means, the political power, the economic power. And the agenda is set by those people. And yes, that can be then frustrating for those people who are sitting outside of those corridors of power. That's where interdisciplinary thinking does come in, because the way that our disciplines have been structured is because of who had the power. It's because of colonial powers, because of colonial epistemologies, because of the epistemological prisons in which we still keep ourselves and we still say, I'm in this faculty, I'm in this department, and so on. Where does that come from? It comes from some notion that these things are separate, and that agenda was set by people with the power to set those agendas hundreds of years ago. And so I think the frustration around that, I understand where that is, the irritation, I understand where that is. For me, some of the frustrations and irritations around this interdisciplinary work is that people all agree at the root level, yes, of course it's necessary, yes, of course we will benefit from working together, nobody's going to dispute that. But I do think that what we need to think about is, from what sort of shared assumptions do we proceed? What sort of shared methods do we use in order to go forward? And what sort of shared morality do we have to drive this forward? Because it's not simply saying everybody needs to sit around the table and we're all going to work together. There have to be some kind of shared perspectives and some agreement in this multilateral world that we are going for a greater good, and what is that greater good? And if we move from that point onwards, then we have more power to do things than simply saying everybody needs to work together.
Can we have another round of questions, please? I see lots of questions and I don't want it. 1:30. Right. Anthony? And then let's take a round of three. Adam? Yes. Let's take rounds of three so that people can answer. And if you do want to put it specifically to one member of the panel, then that's okay. If you leave it wide open, then that's also.
Anthony Bezos from Political Sciences. So maybe it's a spread across just the thoughts and perhaps across analysts. But attending to your thing, Fisher, about kind of does war have agency, and kind of my suggestion is that kind of giving ontological primacy to human beings have the capacity to read. I think ignores the fact that it's certainly not an exclusive Western exercise. That historically, human beings have been encouraged to read more, mediated by something. And that mediation, I would argue, is the divine personification of war. And that's what's happened historically. Is that quite simply we read through the divine entities that we personify as representative of that in order to make this meaning making. So my suggestion now is that perhaps since gods are dead and we have killed them, the very process of apotheosis from this kind of divine personification of war kind of has forced us to lose the center of gravity in terms of reading war, quite simply because we've lost the mediators through which we understand war. And dare I say that perhaps it is the Abrahamic religions and the presence of monotheism, and therefore us killing gods, that in fact now makes it very, very difficult for us to read, and what gives us the right to read, I suppose, as human beings. It's a great challenge we put upon ourselves by giving ourselves this kind of ontological primacy and the slippage that comes from our egos of suspecting that we may read through our positivistic disciplines and the rest of academia.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam Lowe, Political Science at UP. So this was obviously an academic discussion, reading or interpreting war. What is agency? Does war have a disciplined or interdisciplinary kind of thinking around war? This is very important, it's valuable, and it's understandable given where this is happening and the question that was posed. But I want to draw on Marx's dictum that philosophers have interpreted the world in many ways, but the point is to change it, and to just hear from the panel, not about reading war, but how best can we maybe intervene in war, and would that be, as academics, beyond just to sort of hear thoughts, because we're going to go back to our opposite after this, but the bombs will keep going, and is there responsibility beyond interpreting the world?
Thank you. And then I'll come and do another round of questions.
Thanks, Chair. I'm Conrad Bayer from the political science. I would like to know what room does the panel think is there for a more quantitative approach, looking at trends, correlations, maybe even causation in terms of war historical view. For example, a simple but interesting example, there are quite prominent academics that argue that we are living in by far the most peaceful times in the history of mankind, looking at the percentage of people of the whole population dying of war. One can easily think we live in a time of war, but looking at the data, it's actually extremely comparatively peaceful.
Questions from the panel? We're over exaggerating war as related for design entities, and to what extent should we intervene?
Good question, right? With no gods, is it harder to read war? Are we giving ontological privacy to humans to read war? I mean, my take on all of this is that war creates all these, and in fact existence, but war in particular, but human existence, but let's focus on war because it's particularly problematic, demands meaning but defies it all the time, right? So it's kind of problematic. Like, existence is kind of difficult, right? It's the kind of burden of consciousness. We're kind of constantly trying to make sense of stuff, right? But the reality of existence, and particularly war, because it's so fraught, people being blown up and it's just horrible, it demands meaning, but it also defies it. Now, if for a long time we have used the idea of a deity around which to order our meaning of war, fine, so the deity goes. So that could say, well, we're less able then to order war. But you could also say that's an opportunity, all right? So then we can try and make meaning in a myriad of other ways, right? Because the whole thing about excessivity of experience of lived reality is that it's productive and an opportunity, right? So if you were able, with some kind of divine idea, to chart all the ways in which people have ever tried to make sense of war, you wouldn't even get close to all the possible ways that might exist for how we could understand it. So if we are in a historical period where there is a dominant theme of understanding, and then that gets challenged, that sounds like an opportunity to me. But we can try and think about other ways. I mean, this is also about decolonization and questioning the university and interdisciplinarity, right? It's about the problem that normative forms of knowledge are necessarily exclusivist. We need to get rid of that exclusivism and open ourselves up to all sorts of possibilities of knowing. And so if any dominant form of knowledge gets knocked off its pedestal, that sounds like an exciting opportunity to me. And I guess there then is the answer to Adam's question about what's our responsibility for doing in the world. Well, if we are scholars and our first task is to generate knowledge about the world and our place in it, then maybe taking the starting point of overcoming the normativities that we have historically imposed upon ourselves for how we do knowledge is a good starting point. So there, I think that's kind of important. You know, let's not pretend we can end war, but maybe we can do a better job of understanding it, because our job is understanding it. And I would say quantitative approach is just part of that. I don't really believe in the distinction between qualitative and quantitative, right? Because I think a quantitative approach to understanding something is just another knowledge methodology, which is valid. But it's not absolute, because there is no such thing as absolute knowledge, because lived reality, war, is excessive to our ability to understand it. That is the human condition.
Yeah, on the second question by Adam, I have to agree with yours. I think we go back to what we do, which is trying to understand the causes of war, which is opposite of what we're asked to do today. I think we spend most of our time, whether economists or scientists, trying to make sense of different social phenomena, including war. So I think the challenge is to go back to what we do best, find the causes of these wars. My own work critiques the nation-state project as it is applied to the African continent, especially as it especially the way that it creates or it becomes a source of violence in the whole of Africa, particularly as compared to the rest of the African continent. So that's where I would spend most of my energies, really, trying to find the causes of cycles of political violence that we see, not just on the continent, but elsewhere as well. And I don't think we're exaggerating the prevalence of war. Again, bringing it to the African context, Africa has more civil wars than other regions of the world. So I think there's a certain urgency in terms of trying to understand wars in Africa, particularly civil wars in particular, because half of the continent is currently experiencing civil wars.
I think where, to start with that, and of course I'm saying this as a psychologist, is think about, nations don't go to war, countries don't go to war, people go to war. So you have to understand what the drivers of people, where are the motivations there. And if you try to understand that, you try to get to the causes of what's it about, scarcity of resources, is it about power dynamics, what is it that drives these, from a really personal perspective, what is it that drives people to use their institutions to go to war with other nations, other institutions, and so forth. You can try to understand that, then you can try to intervene. But I don't want to sound kind of despairing here of this. People are complicated, and as I said, evil is not an ESM. So sometimes it's really difficult to intervene because sometimes the reasons are so obscure and so rooted in something that is just purely irrational and cannot be understood from an interventional perspective, that you're not going to be able to intervene. And at that point, what do you do? I mean, you can imagine the kind of things positive thinking about this, and I think that I agree with the read those, the people who've written about that, those papers and those books about, how positive we are. I think that better now than in any other age in human history. That's absolutely.
Wait for Emma.
Thank you. No, that's it. So if we, on the question of how to intervene, I think the first thing that we have to ask is, who will decide? Okay, so what would be a valid intervention? And we are not used to asking those kinds of questions. We haven't got them how to ask those kinds of questions. So it's not just that something will happen and then somebody decides that it will happen and okay, that's the way it is. And this is what frightens me of the time. So I would say we have to be aware that, more aware than ever, because this has always been the case, but it's at a much larger scale now, that we are manipulated. And we have to ask who is manipulating us for which reasons. So we have to go back to the Enlightenment motto of having the courage to think for ourselves, which brings me to the quantitative data. I think you have to really define what you mean in terms of peaceful. So if people are better off, fair enough, but you have also to define what that means. So economically, so on, because, and again, so that means we have to think for ourselves what this would mean, because also what is happening is, in terms of what I said, the role that language is playing, certain narratives are playing in stoking this fear of technology combined with military might and all of these things, and we live in very intense, unstable times. Not necessarily that all of us are at war, but then we have to redefine what war is because it is shifting shape. Okay, and I think that is also the thing that frightens us, plus our bedrock, that always we had international law is moving. So I would not agree that it's more peaceful. It's far more unsettling than ever, regardless of empirical. But it will depend on all the factors. But yeah, we have to think about ourselves.
Thanks. I'm going to respond to Anthony at the back, right? I was listening to all my colleagues and listening to the question, trying to exactly pinpoint what your question was. So apologies if I'm not interpreting it. I'm speaking broadly. In terms of, I think, divinization, personification, ontology, and the right that we have to actually read war, right? I think more or less that's the gist of some of it. And the way that maybe war is given divine, or a narrative, that war is given a divine sanction. And that is something I also derived from an aspect of what you are saying. I think at least we must be careful. There is a long-standing history in the tradition of religious sanction of violence. I think if you denounce that or you say that it doesn't exist, you're living in a different world. That is unfortunate, but I think there's a counter-narrative as well. And the counter-narrative is that equally you would be able to say, but there are perspectives within religion that argues against divinization of war, personification, giving people who are making these decisions in terms of going into war and giving a war a holy status. There would be equally enough, I think, arguments within religions to say that this is justified from a religious perspective. It's like I always say, because I do a lot of work in women's leadership and gender studies, and religion is at the same time a perpetrator, but also a liberator as well. And I think within that tension, we always find ourselves, particularly when it comes to this situation, from our own religious tradition, there is such a thing as serious anger towards injustice. One of the themes or scenes that pop up immediately is the well-known one of Jesus becoming very angry in terms of injustice to the point that he threw tables. But he and the theology of the early church and evangelists espoused his vulnerability and his pacifism as a virtue, right? But they did not exclude or preclude the possibility of becoming angry and protesting injustice. And this is where the discussion really gets interesting in terms of the just war doctrine, how we think about the ends and the means, and the means to address injustice. I think that's something we can talk long and hard about, and this is basically a theme that went throughout. But I'm not saying I interpreted your question, that's what I got. I think there are meta-narratives in terms of how war and the people who make these decisions about war are turned into divine beings, and war is given divine sanction. But I think there is a counter-narrative. And that counter-narrative doesn't always speak loud enough. Just in terms of the qualitative approach, I wanted to make sure if there is there an argument that the world today is less violent? Because I wonder about that. I would argue that violence is becoming more sophisticated. And I see this in my work in gender work. So what happens is that overt sexism has just gone underground. So you don't see it, but it's there. And the fact that it's there and it's not visible means it's even harder to address it and pinpoint it and protest it, because it's like trying to catch smoke. And so I would argue that violence has become more sophisticated in all the different ways that the panel has mentioned. And I would wonder if we could say that the world is less violent. I'm not saying that's what you're saying, it's for me a question to ponder. So thank you so much.
Okay, we have 15 minutes to go. What is another question? Yes, please. Yes, and then yes, please introduce yourself.
Yes. but I want to start with an anecdote. Don't like Sulguri, those of you who bring our own experience. At the end of the African War, depending on where the school you went to, the war general, having braved and the rebels like him, cross north to Zimbabwe, tells the Baralon king, chief, Moroccan, that I'll take the land and I'll give you the Baralon chief says, my friend, if you've taken the land, where am I going to raise my cattle? Where am I going with this narrative? I want to suggest that if you trace the history of the empire across the globe, if you trace the history of the empire and the wars that it carried out, the fundamental motive of all wars has always been the land. And it's something, and I'm using land here, not in the narrow sense of this in space. I'm using land here as a resource that speaks to the resources beneath the land, but also the resources that we can see above the land. And that is linked to the history of extraction. Whether you're thinking of extraction of minerals, resources, whether you're thinking of extraction of timber, as we saw in Liberia, those who do understand that history, a brilliant environmental historian called Mitman writes so eloquently about the battle over the rubber production in Liberia and ways in which the extraction of the forestry there almost brought the Americans and the British to war. So extraction, I'm trying to suggest, is fundamentally central to what we see here as well. Even in the most recent experiences, we talk about, so lately, Trump going to Venezuela and arresting the leader there. The narrative on the surface of it is the dictator is messing up with our society, but at the same time, Trump says, we want their oil. Similarly, the war in the Middle East, as we know it today, they frame it, they tell us, these Khomeinis, whatever, they're dictators, they're terrorizing. In the meantime, back home, the man is terrorizing his own people. Okay? You know what the ICE is doing there? He's terrorizing his own people. He wants to own democracy. And yet, we know. He says, we are going to have their oil. So I'm basically making a very basic point. Fundamental, all wars. Whether you are thinking of sub-imperialism, like the one that the Zulus were engaged in, it's about resources. It's about resources. And I think that unless we come to terms with the history of extraction, whatever nature, we can never fully pretend that we understand or we know how to be more.
Thank you, James. And ICE is also about extraction.
Stefan Muir, Ancient and Modern Languages and Cultures. Thank you very much to all the panelists. I really enjoyed your speaks, and although the director of CAS said we don't need agreement, I personally found quite a lot of agreement, a fairly broad agreement in the panel. that war is irrational, it is incomprehensible, we cannot make meaning, it defies meaning. I heard it's maybe not readable at all. It almost sounded as if war is something like an archaic form of humankind. It comes from somewhere down there and we cannot really actually touch it. Yet, if it is an archaic thing, it is precisely humankind who create wars, not animals, I think, except for some primates. So why specifically human, the Homo sapiens, goes to war? A potential answer can be the key term compensation. Are we compensating our rationality here in some way? That's a question to all the panelists.
Yes, my name's Freddie. I'm from zoology and entomology. My question has a very similar basis as the previous question, in that I believe, but I may be completely wrong, that that there's a general consensus that war is inherently illogical and can't remember the other word now. But so I'm curious to hear if anyone would be able to argue for the other side in that war can be, or even a hypothetical case where a war can be very justified and logical. Because I felt like that may be the reason why it's hard to read, because it's always unjustified and illogical. Is that how it was? Sorry. Freddie, from zoology and entomology, Freddie. Yeah, is that the reason war is hard to read, or can there be a scenario where war can be very justified and logical? And to clarify, I don't mean to defend yourself against an invading body, I mean more instigating.
Okay, if you could please keep your responses brief to this, and then we'll have one last round of 3 questions, and then we'll wrap up. So please.
In terms of James' comments and question to us, just a comment back, James. Thank you very much for flagging this, because it's really interesting, because I've just read an article in last week's Mail and Guardian, specifically on reading war, but from a structural reading on war, where the point is made very clearly that sovereignty is not about flags and constitutions anymore. The quest for sovereignty is about resources. It's about access to energy, to trade routes, to technology, and so on. And so we are, as always, this is what I wanted to flag when I said before about shapes and shifting. Many things are shifting, and we are still looking for the answers in the wrong place in some way. Very, very quickly on the irrationality, Stefan, I actually think, and to some sense it's an answer to Freddie, but also not really, but I think the current format of war is not irrational. And I think that is why when I say that we don't have a lot of time. I think it is immensely calculated, and at least in terms of technology, you can trace it as far back as before the First World War. So let me just say that. Freddie, I don't think that being able to rationally think about war would mean that you would necessarily be able to justify it. But what is more important is to understand it so that you can find ways to intervene, perhaps. But I would be very, I don't. It's not about justifying war. It's about understanding it so that we can find ways to overcome situations that lead us to war. From my point of view. Thank you.
Of course, I should respond on the question on nationality, because I was one of the speakers who the time presentation was centered around. So I did mention that irrationality is not the same as the absence of logic. Because most of the conflicts or the wars that we see, to take a very gruesome example, the Rwandan genocide, for example, that Swadmamdani argued that the genocide was thinkable. And as we have seen, it was quite logical in terms of how it unfolded. But we can equally understand it as deeply irrational at the same time. So, yeah, just my quick response to that. And thank you for your comments, the initial comments. I absolutely have to agree with you. Territorial borders, boundaries, this is my part of the work that I do on the Horn of Africa. Some of the most fundamental causes of the wars, whether it be internal wars or inter wars between countries. Territorial disputes are at the core of the violence of the disputes, based on the colonially imposed borders. So there is that tension between state making and nation building in that part of the continent, and I think it applies elsewhere. So I absolutely agree with your take.
Is it time to read a quote?
You're about to quote scripture to us.
It's always got to joke with systematic theologians don't read the Bible as often, and I've got some of my colleagues here, they don't understand what I mean. Just to respond to Freddie, right? There is consensus, and I think all of us are scared of the results of war, which is a good response. We should be scared of it. But within just war theory, I want to read you the former Archbishop of Canterbury's argument, which said there is another perspective. He said, just war theory is a form of statecraft. It is an aspect of political ethics which concerns how to do right in the conduct of ordered community life. That's embedded in the larger framework of just war doctrine. It is a way of saying that war is not some monstrous aberration in human life for which all standing orders are suspended, but it is a set of actions requiring the same virtues as political life in general. The just war tradition is best understood as a sustained and disciplined intellectual attempt to relate the morally legitimate use of proportionate and discriminate military force to morally worthy political ends. Now, this is focused when it's in a public enterprise and not private acts of coercion. Just to say there is another opinion. Whether we agree with this is a whole different point. But yes, there is a different interpretation regarding war as a set of actions with a possible ethical structure. But that's going to regard a longer conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I think what I would like to do is take the final 3 questions, and then we'll give each panelist a chance to summarise and respond to that. Just at the time, because we've got 3 minutes left, I don't want to go too far over. I understand that people have other commitments. So if that's in a good place, then there was one that I saw. That's what you did, and then I'll come to you.
My name is Kopano. I'm a final year student. My question is based on so, my question to the panelists is that would either of you say that the agenda for such wars is driven by the Western objective to divide and conquer? That if Africans are frustrated amongst themselves, they be easier to control?
There was a question at the back, yes?
My name is Kyle Luna. I think I was agree with the gentleman here. War just an act of violence. So if they could elaborate the use of the term irrational and not hide behind, I think sometimes academics hide behind the disciplinary of childhood. So can they just relate and try and explain or elaborate on the use of the term irrational?
I think academics hide behind Charlie. And one final question here, please.
Hi, my name is Nisifo Masisi. I'm a final year LLB student at UP. I'm also a National Council member of the Anti-Apartheid Movement for Palestine. It's local chapter in South Africa. So my question is obviously linked to international law context with regards to this whole idea of a nation-state system, which has basically been transfixed to us in the African continent by, former colonial powers. So in this state of post-coloniality, right, this is where my question comes in. This problem of memory, especially when it comes to war, and how memory obviously, or its manifestations would not necessarily be accurate. I would propose, and I want, inputs on this. I'd propose maybe we have we protect this right to collective memory in, the human, the Declaration for Human Rights and Declaration for Human Rights. And it becomes an enshrined right, let's say, in the international legal system, whereby other nation states would follow and protect this right, whereby when it gets violated, there can be an international response to maintain national peace and security. Thank you.
Final comments and thoughts from the panelists. Can I start possibly with
Yeah, because I maybe I'll address the rationale and so I think we can break love's stories, they love's narrative, and that's what makes sense. And that's why you always have to have justification for actions, because when you don't have justifications for actions, then it becomes, then something looks like it is irrational, because it doesn't seem to be a real A to B to C, this is where we end up at D, and that's the reason why we do it. We always are making narratives, we're always making stories. Our whole lives are based on narrative, and our brains make sense of the world in that way. It has to be that way. That's how we keep ourselves sane, because otherwise everything is just a series of unrelated and interconnected, unconnected events, and that is something that's actually intolerable. People feel actual pain when that doesn't happen. So we have a need to make sense of these things, and so we make up these stories about why are we going to war, and when the story doesn't make sense, and we say that is irrational. So I get back to, well, what is the purpose of the war? Why do we do things? And it is largely about resource acquisition. It's largely about extraction. But, Emma's has talked about shape-shifting and, different ways in which these wars are being waged. But ultimately, it seems to me, it is all about that. But nobody will say that to you directly, to say, the reason I am going to war is I need that oil. Why do I need that oil? Because I want to make my life more comfortable in some way. Why do I need my life to be more comfortable? Why do I need an extra $1 billion, a couple of billions I already have? Purely because I'm greedy. For no other reason. I don't need that. Do I need another gold tap in my third yacht? Not really. But I want one. That's what it is. But that doesn't really make sense to people to say that, because there is some sense of that is not a good thing to be saying. So it is about extraction, it's about the perception of irrationality, because these reasons don't make sense to us. We try to make stories that do make sense. It's all about that meaning, it's all about that making sense. And if we can go behind the curtain and try to figure out this is why people are doing what they're doing, then you can get to intervention. Sometimes that intervention might be that you just need to cut off those people from the sources of power. Those people who are going to use it for pure extraction, pure acquisition for themselves, maybe they don't need to to assess who is fit to be a leader and is going to hold the moral good primary and not a personal acquisition.
I mean, I want to go back quickly to this question of extraction. I mean, yeah, probably. But I think if we're trying to understand war, we shouldn't just look at the intentions of people who are in particular positions of power to press a button. We need to think about the enablers, right? So I might be Trump and I want this. But what is the context that enables me to mobilize all sorts of other people to do this collective act of violence? Right? So whatever I want, the context kind of matters. But more than that, in my own work, I'm more interested in the unintentional political effects of war. Like an event like war or anything does all these other things politically and non-politically, personally. And it's those effects that I think are really important. I mean, if you're in Palestine, in Gaza, and you've been bombed, someone says, "Oh, it's Trump, he wants oil." Someone says, "Netanyahu, he's a fascist." It's irrelevant. You've been bombed. Your life has been destroyed. So I think we should, although intentions are important, we shouldn't mix intentions with causes, and we should also think about what war does beyond the intentions of individuals. And as a result of that, the question of the archaicness of humanness, I don't know. I mean, my whole point is that war is excessive to our ability to understand it because experience, life is excessive to our ability to understand it. And I'm interested in how actually very clever politicians, ironically, kind of get that. There's a part to politics that's not about meaning, it's about demonstration. Right? It's not about, look, I'm justified, this is my story, this is why we're doing it. It's about, look, I just dropped a bomb in your house. You dropped a bomb in my house. Right? There's a performative side to violence, which it makes intention and meaning and rationality and justification kind of irrelevant. I'm powerful. That's it. I mean, this is what I think Ashil Mbembe picks up on in his book on the post-colony, right? Everybody's obsessed with this meaning or that meaning or politics or representation. What Ashil Mbembe is talking about, no, politics is performative, demonstrative. Everybody's sucked up in the awe of this powerful person. I mean, Trump plays this brilliantly, right? Look at me, I may be orange, I may be a lunatic, but I'm powerful, right? That works, I think, in the States quite well. And then the illogical, irrational, I mean, my understanding of your point about irrationality is not that it's irrational, it's that it's beyond rationality. Right? The experience of war is beyond meaning making. That's kind of my point, and that's where I think we could have a long conversation. Maybe I'll stop there because time is up.
Thank you. Closing comments? No?
Briefly respond to your initial question. I wouldn't say there's a deliberate effort by the way at some point we also have to acknowledge Africa's own agency in terms of the violence that we see, the physical violence and the conflict that we see. So I wouldn't say there's a deliberate effort, but what we do have is an enduring legacy of Africa's colonial past, which remains, especially if we connect to the territorial borders, boundaries,
Thank you very much. Well, we could go on ad infinitum, but unfortunately we'll have to go to close it. To thank the speakers for their very thoughtful and genuinely provocative contributions. To thank everybody for their time, to make time to come here and listen and contribute. To thank Peter Vale for coming up with the idea, and to thank Professor Mkunazi for generously giving us the space, and also, I believe, providing some nibbles and refreshments which are outside waiting for us that have been so patient. Thank you very much, everybody, and I wish you a good day. forward, but of course it will. You know, it's good news. Did the record go?
But I will check because they are
I'll let you know the next time. Yeah, we should have thumbs up. I think, yeah, we just need to work out what the best way to take it forward
Last 2 weeks ago.
Yes. Why do you keep asking that?